In a small town where faith was supposed to guide its people, one trusted figure, Pastor Jacob Turner, had everyone fooled. A young, charismatic man, he was the embodiment of everything the community admired. But behind the pulpit, hidden in plain sight, was a darkness so horrifying it would shatter everything. Eleanor Davis, his wife, had been living a life of luxury and faith, blissfully unaware of the monster she had married. But when her suspicions grew, she discovered a dark, dirty secret that no one could have ever predicted. And before the truth could be fully exposed, Eleanor would pay the ultimate price for it. What happened when Eleanor decided to confront the man she loved, and the chilling secret he was desperate to keep hidden? Stay with us as we unravel the twisted tale of manipulation, deceit, and murder that no one saw coming. Because sometimes, the darkest truths are hidden behind the people we trust the most. Before we unravel this intriguing story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Tales. Stay tuned for more gripping tales that expose the darkest depths of human nature and behavior. Pastor Jacob Turner wasn't just another man in a small Texas town. He was the embodiment of everything people believed a pastor should be. Born and raised in the state, Jacob was no stranger to hard work. He had grown up in a modest household, the son of a hard-working, humble family. From an early age, Jacob's charm was undeniable. He was the kind of person who could walk into any room and immediately have everyone's attention, a skill he later refined as he began to rise within the church community. It didn't take long for Jacob to make a name for himself. He was well-spoken, articulate, and deeply passionate about his faith. His sermons were filled with powerful imagery, his voice carrying authority and compassion. The congregation found themselves captivated by his words, drawn in by his charisma and apparent sincerity. For many, Jacob wasn't just a pastor. He was a beacon of hope, a figure who could guide them through life's hardest challenges. His rise through the church was swift. Within just a few years, he had moved from leading small community events to overseeing large congregations. His influence stretched far beyond the pulpit, as people began to trust him, not just with their spiritual well-being, but with their most personal struggles. To them, Pastor Jacob Turner was a man who could be counted on, a rock in an ever-changing world. But even as Jacob's reputation grew, so did whispers of his popularity. He was a man everyone seemed to love and admire for his leadership and his ability to connect with people. The town spoke highly of him, often praising his dedication to helping those in need and his generosity. But, as with any figure in the public eye, there was always a layer of curiosity, a question of just how perfect someone could truly be. It was in the midst of this rise to fame that Eleanor Davis entered his life. Eleanor, a widow in her early 50s, had lived a full life after her first husband's untimely passing. She had inherited a vast fortune, built from decades of family business and real estate investments. But despite her wealth, Eleanor had always preferred a quiet, private life. She had traveled the world, seen it all, and yet there was something she had never been able to find: a true connection. That was until she met Jacob Turner. At first, the relationship seemed innocent enough. He was her pastor, someone she trusted implicitly. She admired his dedication to the church, his inspiring sermons, and his apparent care for the well-being of his congregation. She would come to him for spiritual guidance, and he would provide the wisdom and comfort she sought. Over time, however, their connection deepened, and it became clear to those around them that their bond was no longer just professional. Jacob's ability to charm Eleanor was undeniable. He was attentive and caring, and gave her the attention she had been yearning for. It wasn't long before they were inseparable. The community watched with interest as the two began spending more and more time together. Their relationship blossomed quickly, and soon they announced their engagement. To outsiders, it seemed like a perfect match. Eleanor, with her wealth and status, and Jacob, the ambitious young pastor with a heart for service. Their wedding was a grand affair, held in the church where Jacob had first risen to prominence. The ceremony was nothing short of spectacular. It was a union that everyone had hoped for. A powerful religious figure marrying into wealth, blending faith with fortune. For many, it seemed like a dream come true. The couple quickly became the envy of the town. They were the ideal power couple. He was the preacher who guided the faithful, and she was the elegant, sophisticated woman who brought grace and elegance to every room. It was a partnership that embodied the dreams of the community, and no one could have predicted the horrors that would soon unfold. But as the days passed and the couple settled into their new life together, cracks began to form in what seemed like a flawless facade. Unseen by the public eye, the perfect life they projected would soon unravel. No one could have guessed that this charming religious figure, the very man who had captured the hearts of so many, was harboring a secret that would change everything. And soon, that secret would come to light in a way no one could have imagined. At first, everything appeared perfect. Jacob Turner and Eleanor Davis were living a life that many admired, the envy of the small town. The wedding was only the beginning of what seemed like an idyllic partnership. But behind the closed doors of their lavish home, things were beginning to change. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Eleanor, once the center of social gatherings, began to withdraw. Invitations to charity events, dinner parties, and even casual get-togethers became less frequent. Eleanor, a woman who had always been at the heart of the community, now seemed more and more isolated. Friends noticed the change, but they attributed it to the honeymoon phase of marriage, the time when a couple huddles close, enjoying their newfound life together. But as weeks turned into months, the isolation deepened. Eleanor's calls to old friends grew less frequent, and her once vibrant presence in church events began to fade. Those who knew her best began to ask questions. Questions that, at first, no one dared to voice aloud. Was something wrong? Whispers of concern started to surface. Her closest friends began noticing that she wasn't her usual self. Something had shifted in her demeanor. She seemed more withdrawn, more cautious in her actions. And the one person who used to always accompany her, Jacob, was often seen in church offices, busy with his work, leaving her alone. It was strange, especially considering how newlyweds are typically inseparable. But what seemed odd was the way Jacob's behavior had started to change as well. Church members began to notice subtle shifts in his conduct. Where he had once been the bright, charming figure in front of the congregation, now there were moments of tension, quiet outbursts, and an air of frustration when he spoke about certain topics. Some even described his sermons as growing colder, less passionate, as though something had drained his once dominant presence. It wasn't just his moods that were off. His relationship with Eleanor began to show signs of strain. There were nights when Jacob was absent for hours, leaving Eleanor alone, brooding in silence. Her friends would tell stories of how she seemed different when he wasn't around, more relaxed, even laughing in a way they hadn't seen in months. But those moments were fleeting. One of her closest friends, Claire Simmons, began to worry deeply. Claire had known Eleanor for over a decade, and the change in her friend was nothing short of alarming. She was always so full of life, always the first to get out and do something, especially after her first husband passed. I could see it in her eyes. She was no longer the same person. She seemed afraid, Claire would later say in an interview. Another church member, Andrew Miller, also voiced concerns. Jacob was different after the wedding. At first, it was small things. He seemed distracted. But then I started noticing things that were harder to ignore. He didn't like it when people spoke too highly of Eleanor in front of him. It was subtle, but there was tension there. And Eleanor, she seemed to just shrink when he was around, like she was walking on eggshells. I thought maybe it was just marriage jitters, but the more I saw, the more I realized something wasn't right. Whispers about the couple's strange dynamics began to spread among the congregation. Was Jacob controlling? Was he too possessive of Eleanor? Or had something deeper taken root within their marriage? Was Jacob after her wealth? Still, no one could have predicted how soon those whispers would be tested. Behind the closed doors of their home, Eleanor had started digging into something that might have revealed the truth about her new husband's past. She had begun to question the stories he told her, the inconsistencies in his behavior, and the strange ways he'd reacted when certain topics were brought up. In the back of her mind, she began to fear that Jacob might be hiding something. She just didn't know what. Yet. It was during this period of growing concern that Eleanor made a chilling discovery. By the time she realized the truth, it might already have been too late. The signs were there. Too many subtle hints to ignore. The question was no longer whether something was wrong, but how much time Eleanor had before the unraveling would begin. Eleanor had always been a protective grandmother, especially when it came to her grandchildren. During the holiday visit, she had become increasingly uneasy about Jacob's behavior toward her 10-year-old granddaughter, Lucy. It started with small, subtle signs. Jacob's overly affectionate gestures, his strange insistence on spending more time alone with Lucy, and Lucy's discomfort around him. Eleanor noticed that Lucy was often stiff when near Jacob, her smile forced and her usual talkative nature stifled. But Eleanor couldn't put her finger on anything concrete, until one evening when she became more observant. After dinner, while the children were playing outside, Jacob and Lucy were left alone in the living room. Eleanor, who had been in the kitchen, grew suspicious when she noticed the door to the living room slightly ajar. She quietly stepped closer, hearing murmurs, but unable to make out the words. She stood there for a moment, watching through the crack in the door. What she saw made her heart stop. Jacob was sitting on the couch, and Lucy was next to him. His arm was casually draped around her, but Eleanor's gaze immediately focused on his hand, which had slipped lower onto her granddaughter's back. Lucy, clearly uncomfortable, had her body angled away from him, her eyes fixed downward as if trying to avoid the situation. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she watched Jacob's hand move in a way that seemed too intimate, lingering longer than it should have. Her gut clenched. This wasn't just affection, it was something deeper, more inappropriate, something she couldn't ignore. But Eleanor remained still, her heart pounding, too afraid to make her presence known, not wanting to alarm either of them just yet. She stepped back quietly and went to her room, her mind racing with disbelief and confusion. Was she overreacting? Or had she just witnessed something deeply wrong? Unable to sleep that night, Eleanor's thoughts swirled. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. The image of Jacob's hand on Lucy's back haunted her, and she knew she had to confront him. She could no longer dismiss her instincts as mere worry or paranoia. The next day, after the children had gone to bed, Eleanor confronted Jacob. They were alone in the study, the room heavy with the tension that had been building for days. Eleanor had already made up her mind. She had to confront him about what she had seen. "Jacob," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "we need to talk." Jacob looked up from the papers he was reading, a slight smile on his face. He seemed calm, perhaps unaware of the storm brewing inside Eleanor. "Of course, Eleanor, what's on your mind?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she tried to steady her nerves. She wasn't sure how he would react, but she knew she couldn't keep quiet any longer. "I saw you with Lucy last night," she said, her voice firm. "I saw the way your hand was on her back. Too low. She looked uncomfortable. I need an explanation." Jacob's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Surprise, defensiveness, or perhaps guilt. His smile faded slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Eleanor," he said, his tone placating, "you're imagining things. I was just comforting her. You know how affectionate I am with the children." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. Her suspicions had been growing for days, and now she was certain that something wasn't right. "Comforting her?" Eleanor echoed, her voice tight. "No, Jacob. It wasn't just comforting. You were touching her inappropriately. I'm asking you right now to explain yourself." For a moment there was silence. Jacob's face became cold, his demeanor shifting from calm to defensive. "You're overreacting, Eleanor," he said, his voice sharp. "I would never hurt any of the children. You know that." But Eleanor wasn't backing down. She had seen enough, and now she had to confront him with the truth. Though Jacob's response was calm, Eleanor knew she couldn't simply let this go. That night, Unable to trust Jacob's words, Eleanor began to look through his personal belongings. She needed answers, something concrete, and her instinct told her there had to be more hidden beneath the surface. After Eleanor's initial confrontation with Jacob, she knew she couldn't stop there. The unease she felt, along with the physical evidence she had uncovered, made it clear that Jacob's history wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. He had used his position as a pastor to manipulate and exploit children, and Eleanor was determined to uncover the full extent of his actions. She could no longer rely solely on her instincts. She needed solid proof from others. Eleanor began reaching out to parents who had brought their children to the church for various activities over the years. Many of these families trusted Jacob implicitly, as he had been a respected figure in the community. But Eleanor had her doubts about how many parents were truly aware of what might have been happening behind the scenes. She started by contacting parents whose children had participated in the church's youth sessions, after-school programs, and summer camps. She began by casually asking them about their children's experiences, trying to gauge their responses. Eleanor had a sharp intuition, and she could tell when parents were hesitant or uncomfortable in their answers. Some didn't seem to think anything was out of the ordinary, but others grew uneasy when Eleanor gently probed deeper. At first, Eleanor approached the conversations with care, trying not to alarm anyone unnecessarily. "I'm just checking in," she'd say with a warm smile. "You know how much Jacob has cared for the kids, but I'm wondering if your child has said anything unusual about their time at the church sessions?" For some parents, there was an initial look of confusion. They hadn't heard any complaints from their children, and they trusted Jacob without question. However, there were a few parents whose discomfort became apparent as the conversation continued. One mother, Brenda Miller, whose 12-year-old daughter Sarah had been involved in several of the church's youth programs, seemed particularly uncomfortable when Eleanor casually brought up the topic. Brenda initially brushed it off, but then her daughter's name came up. "Sarah's always loved going to those sessions," Brenda said, but her voice faltered. "She's never mentioned anything bad. She's been a little distant lately, but I thought it was just normal teenager stuff." Eleanor leaned in slightly, sensing that there was more to the story. "Has she ever said anything specific about Jacob? About how he interacted with the children?" Brenda hesitated. "Well, now that you mention it, Sarah did mention that Jacob had asked her to stay behind after one of the sessions. She didn't say much about it, but I don't know. I just thought it was innocent. She said he wanted to talk to her about her grades." Eleanor felt her stomach twist. She didn't want to make assumptions, but everything she had uncovered so far pointed in one direction. "Did she seem comfortable with it?" Eleanor asked gently, her voice calm but serious. Brenda frowned. "I guess not. Now that you mention it, she seemed a little uncomfortable talking about it. She didn't want to go back after that session. She just said he was weird, but didn't elaborate." Eleanor knew this was the first real breakthrough. Brenda had mentioned that Sarah had felt uncomfortable after spending time alone with Jacob, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. As Eleanor listened, it became clear. Sarah's discomfort might be just the tip of the iceberg. Over the next several days, Eleanor continued speaking with more parents, some whose children had long outgrown the church's youth programs, and others whose children were still involved. Slowly, more parents opened up, each telling stories of strange, isolated moments with Jacob that they hadn't thought twice about until now. Another mother, Rachel Dawson, whose 11-year-old son, Ben, had attended a few summer camps, told Eleanor that Ben had once mentioned how Jacob often pulled him aside for special talks. Ben didn't seem bothered by it, but Rachel now realized it was strange. Why was Jacob the one pulling the kids aside? She wondered aloud, as if the question had never occurred to her before. Eleanor grew more alarmed as she pieced together the various stories. No one had spoken out yet, but the pattern was becoming clear. Jacob had used his position to create moments of isolation with the children, moments that could easily be brushed off as innocent, special attention, one-on-one talks about grades or spiritual matters. But in hindsight, Eleanor realized these were the moments in which he could exert control over the children, manipulating them with his power and charm. Armed with this new information, Eleanor knew it was time to take more direct action. With her evidence growing, Eleanor could no longer let Jacob's actions go unchecked. One evening, when the children had gone home and the house was quiet, she called Jacob into the study again. This time, she wasn't going to be as polite or indirect. She had gathered too much information to be ignored, and she knew the truth now. "Jacob, we need to talk," Eleanor said, her voice sharp and unwavering. Jacob walked in, seemingly unaware of the storm that was about to break. "What is it now, Eleanor?" he asked, his tone still smooth but with a slight edge. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "I've spoken to the parents of some of the children you've worked with over the years, and they've started telling me things I didn't want to believe. You've been pulling children aside for special talks. Is that right, Jacob?" Jacob's face went pale for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Eleanor, I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tight now. "I'm just trying to help them. I'm their pastor." "Don't lie to me," Eleanor snapped. "I've spoken to parents whose children have been uncomfortable with your behavior. And you know what? I've got enough evidence to prove it. I won't let you hurt anyone else." Jacob's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor. I've done nothing wrong." But Eleanor wasn't backing down. "I've seen enough, Jacob. I've heard enough. And if you don't leave now, I will make sure you face the consequences. I'll take this to the authorities, to the press, and to every parent in this town who has trusted you. I will file a lawsuit against you and make sure your past is exposed." Eleanor stood firm, her resolve unwavering. She knew Jacob had manipulated the trust of the community for years, but now she was ready to take him down. "If you think you can get away with this, think again," she said. "I will make sure everyone knows what you've done. You're done, Jacob. You can't hide behind your title anymore." Jacob, realizing the gravity of the situation, finally turned away in defeat. His charm and manipulations had worked for so long, but they couldn't shield him from the truth now. Eleanor had made her decision, and with the evidence she had gathered, there was no turning back. Eleanor had made the decision to act. And she knew that confronting Jacob directly was not enough. The evidence she had gathered, along with the testimonies from concerned parents, needed to be taken further. She wasn't going to let him get away with his past. She began to prepare for the next steps with precision, reaching out to the right people to ensure that Jacob would face the consequences of his actions. First, Eleanor contacted organizations that specialized in protecting children from abuse and exploitation. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that focused on advocacy and legal aid for victims. One such organization, Safe Horizons, had been instrumental in fighting child abuse cases and had worked with local law enforcement to ensure justice. Eleanor made an anonymous call to their helpline, outlining her suspicions and providing some initial evidence without revealing too much. She was careful at first, wanting to make sure the investigation was handled professionally and without any risk to herself or her family. The organization immediately responded, offering support and access to experts who could help validate her claims and move the case forward. The NGO offered to assist her in compiling the evidence and, if necessary, help expose Jacob through the media to ensure public awareness. They assured Eleanor they would work alongside local authorities, handling the case with the utmost care and confidentiality. Eleanor, knowing that Jacob would likely fight back and attempt to deny the accusations, realized she needed legal protection. She hired a well-known attorney, Catherine Holt, who specialized in sexual misconduct and child abuse cases. Catherine had a reputation for taking on high-profile cases, and she was known for being relentless in her pursuit of justice. Eleanor made it clear from the start that her goal was to ensure that Jacob would not be able to escape the consequences of his actions. Catherine advised Eleanor on the best legal steps to take, helping her file a civil lawsuit and press charges against Jacob. The legal team also worked with the NGOs to help gather additional evidence and witnesses, including statements from other parents whose children had been affected. The wheels were now in motion. Eleanor was determined to not only stop Jacob, but to ensure that he was never able to harm anyone again. Jacob, who had been suspicious of Eleanor's behavior ever since she started asking questions and confronting him, soon began to notice the signs that she was taking action against him. It started with her being distant, no longer the adoring wife he had once known. She became more secretive, taking phone calls late into the night and having hushed conversations with people he didn't recognize. He began to grow paranoid. He knew Eleanor well enough to sense that she was no longer under his control. She had started asking too many questions, and now she was involving people outside their tight-knit circle. Jacob grew increasingly agitated. One evening, after coming home early from a church event, he found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of her, the phone numbers of lawyers and NGO representatives written on a notepad. The color drained from his face when he saw the papers, documents detailing the civil lawsuit and plans to expose him through the media. He understood immediately what she was planning. "Eleanor," Jacob said, his voice eerily calm, "what are you doing?" Eleanor, her face pale but resolute, stood up slowly. "I'm protecting the children, Jacob. I can't let you continue like this. I've already contacted the authorities. It's over." Jacob's eyes flashed with rage. "You think you can destroy me? Do you think you can ruin everything I've worked for? You're making a mistake, Eleanor." The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface of Jacob's composed exterior finally boiled over. He stormed out of the room, but Eleanor knew it was only a matter of time before he retaliated. She couldn't risk staying silent any longer. She had made her choice, and now she had to protect herself and the children who had been victims of Jacob's manipulation. As the days passed, Jacob's paranoia escalated. He realized that Eleanor had reached a point of no return. She was fully committed to exposing him, and nothing would stop her now. His image, the trust he had spent years building, would come crashing down. The thought of losing everything, of being exposed as the predator he truly was, pushed Jacob to the brink. Late one evening, Jacob confronted Eleanor one last time. The two were alone in their home, the air thick with tension. Eleanor had spent the entire day working with her lawyer and the NGOs, preparing for what was to come. She knew that the police were likely going to be involved soon, and she felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She couldn't go back, and she knew that Jacob wouldn't let her take him down without a fight. "I won't let you do this, Eleanor," Jacob said quietly, his voice now a low hiss. "I built everything with my own hands. I won't let you ruin it all." Eleanor looked at him, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. "You've hurt too many people, Jacob. I'm not going to let you hurt anyone else." That was the moment when Jacob snapped. His rage had reached its peak. He moved toward Eleanor, his anger consuming him as he grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her violently. The confrontation escalated quickly, with Jacob's hands around her neck in a moment of terrifying aggression. Eleanor, terrified but still determined, fought back, trying to break free, but Jacob's strength overwhelmed her. The struggle lasted only a few moments, but it felt like an eternity. Jacob, in a moment of blind rage and desperation, strangled Eleanor, the woman he had once loved and trusted. Her final moments were filled with a mix of shock, fear, and helplessness as she realized just how far Jacob had fallen. Jacob left the house that night, his hands stained with the blood of the woman who had once been his protector and confidant. The investigation into her death would take a toll on the community, especially as the truth about Jacob's dark past began to emerge. But for Eleanor, it was too late. Her fight for justice had ended in the most tragic of ways. As the police arrived and the case unfolded, the full extent of Jacob's crimes would eventually be exposed, but it would be Eleanor's bravery and determination that ultimately brought justice to the victims, even though she would never see it herself. Jacob Turner's trial was swift. The mountain of evidence, from the testimonies of victims to Eleanor's meticulous investigations, left no room for doubt. He was convicted on multiple counts of child abuse, sexual misconduct, and the murder of his wife, Eleanor. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, however, felt hollow. Eleanor's life could not be returned, and the scars he had left behind would haunt the community forever. The emotional toll on Eleanor's family was immense. Her children, especially her daughter Kate, were devastated by the loss of their mother and the horrors surrounding her death. The church, once a beacon of faith and trust, was left in disarray. Members who had revered Jacob as a man of God now questioned their own judgment and the safety of the community they had once thought was untouchable. The aftermath was a painful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and manipulation. Jacob's charm and authority had allowed him to operate behind a veil of trust, deceiving those around him for years. The tragedy of Eleanor's murder was a stark revelation. Behind the face of faith, dark secrets can fester, and those who are meant to protect others can in fact become the greatest threat. The final twist of this story wasn't just the exposure of Jacob's crimes. It was the profound realization that even in places where we feel safest, we must always be vigilant. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, and the damage left behind by those who abuse power can last for generations. As the community tried to heal, Eleanor's legacy remained, a symbol of the courage it takes to stand against evil, even when it wears the mask of righteousness. This heartbreaking story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers that lie behind the facades we trust. Whether it's power, authority, or even faith, Jacob Turner's manipulation and Eleanor's bravery remind us that the truth, no matter how dark, always finds its way to the surface. What do you think Eleanor should have done? How could this tragedy have been prevented? I personally think she should have moved out of the house until after the case. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more intense, real-life crime investigations and shocking revelations. Thank you for watching.